Occasionally, a game will be released that turns the industry on its head. New technologies and engines can push the limitations of graphics and visuals. New business models can set an industry standard for new business practices. New mechanics can redefine the direction of an entire genre, and niche customers can be pleased with a wacky and creative new direction. Shenmue, for better or worse, is one of those games. Year after year, it is lauded as one of the greatest games of all time, while those who dislike the game don't seem to get it.
There's a lot of passion for Shenmue. Is anybody passionate about Shenmue out there?
Is there a way to cancel out passion? Like, could I just stand up here and say, like, look, don't make Shenmue? Can I like, put a stop to it? Is that...
Who here isn't passionate about Shenmue?
It's a fucking bullshit forklift simulator for assholes! You people have been fucking fooled!
Fanatical fans speak its name in hushed whispers and pray for its eventual return, while the number of people who have actually played it are pushed further and further into a minority. So why talk about it? You may be thinking I'm making this video due to the fact that Sega renewed the rights to it this year, or because Yu Suzuki gave a talk about Shenmue at this year's GDC, and in a way you'd be right, but that isn't the whole story. Any word about Shenmue and its continuation is considered news, and I want to discuss this game precisely due to this fact. Why, nearly 15 years after the release of the original, do people still clamor for a third title? What is it about this game that makes people cling to it so dearly, while other people hate it? I could discuss things like the crappy controls while fighting, the excellent soundtrack, the stilted voice acting.
Huh? What are you talking about? My Hong Kong ticket I've already paid.
How it was instrumental in how we think about and design open-world 3D games. How Peter Jackson obviously stole the character design for Gollum. But all that stuff has been said before. Instead, I want to focus on something this game addresses that is rarely explored in other video games. To discuss my point, I need to get something straight in regards to Shenmue. I've found fans have a hard time defending its sources of brilliance. This game is often praised vaguely and in a few sentences. Sure, they may talk about the gameplay, the story, the tone, the graphics, whatever, but all these are really kind of disjointed and tangential. They're smaller pieces of a bigger picture, and these pieces all begin and end with one of the biggest problems people have when discussing why they love Shenmue. That thing is genre. Pinpointing the genre of Shenmue takes some digging. It's a genre that spans multiple definitions and has been utilized quietly in the background of countless films, video games, comic books, novels, and more. That genre is magic realism. Essentially, it's a genre in which the strange and fantastic elements of a story are considered commonplace in an otherwise everyday setting. Seems simple enough, right? Well, not exactly, because Shenmue has a very specific kind of magic and a very specific kind of realism. The magic is anachronistic in a surprising way. Shenmue is set in Japan, was made by Japanese developers, and has a lot of elements common in Japanese revenge stories, but for the most part, the magic follows the traditions and tropes of Wuxia. Wuxia is an expansive genre of Chinese origin. You're probably most familiar with it by way of film. I'm talking about stuff like House of Flying Daggers, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Whatever, Kung Fu Hustle, and so on. Traditionally, these stories feature a young male protagonist who loses someone close to him, and so he sets out for revenge, trains long and hard, and learns from a myriad of secret martial art masters along the way. He experiences a broad range of harrowing events, requiring both strength and skill. Eventually, the protagonist becomes stronger than most other characters in the story and sets right injustices bigger than himself in his quest for vengeance. This aspect bleeds directly over into gameplay. I don't know about you, but I've never had to fight a bunch of strangers to gather clues to avenge my father's death. I never learned evasive combat maneuvers from a homeless man or an entrepreneur. I've never had to chase down a gang leader in a crowded harbor on a motorcycle. I've never had to protect the world from magical artifacts prophesized to doom the world. Shenmue's use of wuxia tropes in the story allows us the opportunity to do so in the gameplay. While Shenmue's magic came from China, its realism came to us from Spain, and in order to discuss exactly how, I need to make a bold claim. If you were to ask me who I thought the main character of the first Shenmue is, I would probably tell you it's not Ryo Hazuki. Sure, we play as him, and the plot is about him, but he doesn't take center stage. He's just a boring, creepy asshole we never really get to know. He liked his dad, I guess. He does karate. He can't read Chinese. And I guess he and Tom are like friends, even though we never really see that as a player. But what were his dreams before his father died? Does he still have them? Does he like or completely hate Fukusan? Because I, as a player, fucking hate him. What kind of music does he listen to? I mean, he's got a bunch of tapes, right? What are his favorite hangout spots around town? Everybody else seems to have one. How does he really feel about Nozomi? I mean, a lot of these problems stem from Japanese cultural practices regarding stoicism, sure. But it's pretty obvious Ryo as a person isn't really the focal point of Shenmue the way most main characters are in other realistic games. You see, the focus of Shenmue as a work of realism is not a person, it's a setting, specifically 1980s Japan. Countless interviews and behind-the-scene articles for Shenmue highlight the meticulous attention that was paid to the environment, its citizens and weather patterns, all in service of compiling a snapshot of a place and time. This type of realism is called Costumbrismo. Costumbrismo is a literary or visual representation of day-to-day life, traditionally popular in the 19th century. And in order to appreciate a few facets of Shenmue, the impact of this type of realism as it pertains to gaming should be recognized. It is a type of realism that doesn't delve too much into grandiose philosophical themes or even cultural commentary, but instead attempts to recreate specific historical cultures as they actually were. Translate that into gameplay. Citizens have their own schedules and dress weather appropriate. These people have preferred friends and places to congregate, and the level design has a realistic, lived-in feel. Entire subplots have no payoff other than the experience of the subplot itself. Nearly every minigame and collectible you can get has no reward or resolution. Hell, towards the end of the game, you gotta ride the bus and get a job just like every other Joe Schmo out there. Ignoring the primary storyline and the kind of gameplay that comes with it, everything in Shenmue seems more like a simulation than a traditional video game. I find it kinda shocking more developers don't go this route when creating historically set games, because I feel a great deal of the praise Shenmue gets directly stems from this quality in their use of this genre. I mean, when people laud Shenmue as a highly immersive experience, it's this kind of crap they're talking about. Now that we have a better grasp of Shenmue's genre and resulting gameplay, I can begin to address the resulting effect. Player tension. When you have two wildly different styles of story and gameplay, most players are going to feel a great deal of tension while playing. Either you'll daydream about taking in the environment while you're beating the tar out of bad dudes, or you'll daydream about beating the tar out of bad dudes while you're taking in the environment. So when this guy says,
Just a bunch of like half-assed ideas put together in a way that you had never seen before.
He's right. But in my opinion, that's a strength of this game, not a weakness. Because without this tension, I don't really think I would appreciate this game to the extent that I do. You see, this tension addresses something most Westerners won't be familiar with, so its exclusion from online discussions is somewhat acceptable. But after I blow your mind, it won't be. I'll spare you a detailed history, but suffice to say after World War II, Japan was experiencing a massive cultural shift. Their surrender sped up the already existing spread of westernization, and this caused a great deal of concern within the population. Young people were becoming infatuated with jeans and rock music, and they had frankly legitimate concerns their cultural heritage would cease to exist. In my opinion, Shenmue as a work of art examines this tension and forces it on the player. Now, it may seem like I'm starting to talk out of my ass, so here's a couple of examples. First, this tension is implicit in Ryo Hazuki himself. He lives in a small hamlet of Japan, is the sole heir to a specific type of karate, and observes several Japanese traditions, but he also wears a totally sweet leather jacket, knows how to drive a motorcycle, and seriously wants to leave the country. This dichotomy of values present showcase this tension quite well. The second, and growing in importance, let's take a look at the villains. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that the majority of Shenmue's bad dudes are foreigners. We'll give Chai a pass since he says Lanji-sama, even though his nationality is never outright revealed. You got a few Japanese street punks too, but let's look at the rest. I mean, we got Chinese dudes, American dudes, maybe Spanish guy? Hell, even a Mexican shows up. They are invasive, but they're also alluring, as they are the driving force in the plot. Which is a nice, easy segue into my final and most important example. Of course, it's the story and the gameplay. The story and the gameplay starts off with a heavy emphasis on the hamlet of Yokosuka, and the gameplay for the first few hours is exclusively the immersive Costumbrismo exploration of the environment. The further the story progresses, the further Ryo travels from home, and the further Ryo travels from home, the more incredible or Wuxia-esque his adventures become. So, as a player, the more worldly we become, the more exotic and exciting the gameplay becomes. Again, there's a distinct allure to the progression of the story, the progression into the other, which ultimately culminates with the final few battles. Remember back to my overly long introduction about genre? About how magic realism features the fantastic invading the everyday? Well, the invasion of the fantastic into the everyday is quite similar to the westernization Japan faced for decades. Now, don't get me wrong, I mean, Shenmue is hardly a perfect game, but the fact that seemingly everything in this game is in service of exploring a very real cultural phenomenon makes it far more interesting than people give it credit for.
God damn it, man, Shenmue.